class that shall not be named. We're here together with people from around the world. We only invite the best of the best. So excited. So welcome to Eva, Arlene, Flossie, Ron, Jeff, David, Gail, and Michael, who are on on Zoom with us. Also Diana and Michael. I said Michael twice. We're also online with throngs of people who are watching on YouTube. So welcome. We talked a lot about Jewish women in the Bible, but we wanted to continue with the idea of famous or influential Jewish women. And so I think it was Flossie or who had the idea of maybe do more modern women, especially ones that were honored here when we had our big event for Women of Reform, Women of Mikveh Israel. So what we're going to do is look at some of the most influential women of the 20th century, although they may have been born in the 19th century. Who are some of the most influential women of the 20th century? If we don't get to ones you know, just let me know, and we'll study some of those. By the way, love the dune buggy behind you, Jeff. Is that what that is, a dune buggy? Is that what you call it?
You're muted.
It is. I built it in 19. Can you hear me? I built it in 1970. Yeah.
Wow, you built it. That's amazing. Did you get to drive it?
Oh yeah. It's a funny story. I wanted a motorcycle, and my parents said as long as I was living at home, I couldn't have a motorcycle. So I built this, which was much more dangerous.
Right. That's what I'm afraid with my kids too. Yes, that's exactly right. So speaking of danger, let's go ahead and start talking about some of the famous women. Some of them, of course, are more famous than other. But there are a lot of women in the 20th century who, of course, had a great effect on our world. And some of them obviously are more famous than other. But we'll start with some who are less famous today, but in a different time period were more famous, and some were more notorious. So we'll start today with, of course, if you're going to talk about notorious Jewish women of the 20th century, there's only one name that speaks out, and her name first is Emma Goldman. And I don't know if you guys have heard of Emma Goldman. She may have heard of her more than I have. Obviously, she was well known if she's being talked about. She died, I think, before most of us were born, 1940. So Ron may have been born before she passed away. But most of us, Ron, what year were you born, Ron?
1932.
So did you ever hear of Emma Goldman when you were living? Or was it, she was kind of towards the tail end of her career then?
Sounds familiar. What do you mean when I was living? Still here.
Oh, when you were young, sorry. When you were living, yes.
Wow.
When you were living.
God.
When you were living in your prime at 7 years old. Sorry.
Well, I was born in 19.
Probably not.
Oh, you were born in 1940, Gail, so.
And I definitely remember hearing about her. She was a famous anarchist.
Exactly. So this is a woman who was a rebel through and through her entire life. She was most famously known as an anarchist and really became an anarchist from birth, it seems like. This is one of those women who was just a rebel all the time. You know, she's born in the Russian Empire. Her parents were Orthodox, and almost early on, right away, she became very, very excited about anarchy. And a lot of it had to do with her family, obviously. She had read about a violent father who used beatings, to try and correct behavior. He was a really terrible person. And obviously, since she was very rebellious, guess who got most of the beatings all the time, because it did not influence her in the way he wanted. And her mother was, kind of not really there. So she had two sisters, one she liked, one she didn't. And, they moved from place to place, really from village to village. This is in the, 1870s, 1880s, because her father was not really very good at anything. He wasn't able to really make a good living. He ran inns, he did this and that, but they would move to city because obviously he wasn't very good at making a living, which probably obviously added to the reason he gave so many beatings. She was very smart, but was not allowed to go to schooling, some because of her father, some because even though she was very bright, she wasn't always allowed to go to the next class because her behavior was so terrible. She was really rebellious. And so after a while, and this continued, her father couldn't make a living, so she had to work, and she studied on the side, but he really wanted women to be women, and they had to, learn to do the cooking, and that was his belief. But she kind of studied on her own, and she read about all the things going on in the world. What Is to Be Done, which was a novel that really inspired her. She read about all the issues going on in the rebellions and everywhere. And despite her father, who really did not want her doing any of these things, and she was finally able to leave. She was living in a world where women were terribly mistreated by her father. Her father didn't do anything like rape her, but other people probably, were violently, attacked her throughout her life in that era. We sometimes glamorize what life was like in the shtetls, but if you outside the shtetls and other places, it could be a very violent place for women. And this was especially true for someone who wasn't married and had a violent father. And so finally, she was able to leave, and at 16, she moved to New York. Now, how did she move to New York? Her sister was moving there with her husband, so her father couldn't do anything to stop her sister, but she was still single, and her father said no. And so she said, all right, I'm basically going to kill myself or throw myself off the boat if you don't. And knowing who she was, he acquiesced, and she got to move to New York. Her father, of course, family eventually moved there as well, because obviously in 1881, the Tsar was assassinated, and the ensuing pogroms that would vibrate like dominoes throughout that part of the world would force all the Jews to move, and a lot of them to America. So she moved here, did the usual thing, was a seamstress, met a man, and married him. He was someone she didn't get along with. Eventually she was rebellious. He was very clingy. He also had some other issues I will not discuss. And, basically the kind of person who, would say, if you leave me, I'm going to commit suicide, that kind of guy. But she did leave him eventually and continued, working until she met two men that really changed her life. And one was Alexander Berkman, and the other was Johann Most. And they were radicals. And they were just the type of people she wanted to be. And so I don't know if she knew what the word anarchist was yet, but this is where she learned it from these two men. And they were radicals. They had radical publications. They really promoted the use of violence to make change. So when we're talking about here is not Mahatma Gandhi or Gloria Steinem. We're talking about somebody who promoted violence. And she and Berkman and Most, especially Berkman, who became her lover and her friend, And they worked together and they continued into this world of just being radicals. And, you know, when there was the famous Homestead strike, I think we've all heard of it. Carnegie's, you know, steel company refused to acquiesce to the demands of the strikers, and people were killed by the Pinkerton Guard. She was the one who wrote articles and promoted it, and you know, tried to, you know, there's even thoughts that she became, you know, that the idea of becoming a prostitute to raise money was a good idea. And what happened was she and Berkman committed a terrible crime, a heinous crime. And they broke into a famous person's office. His name was Henry Clay Frick. And they tried to assassinate him. And he went to prison for 22 years. She would go to prison for a short time for inciting riots. They would go to prison years later for trying to convince people not to enter into the draft for World War I. She was completely opposed to war, which was ironic because she was violent. She was a communist and was actually deported to Russia for her support in, this is after World War I. So she's deported to Russia and was a communist admirer, was speaking about it. And then all of a sudden, she realized that the communism they were practicing in Russia by the Bolsheviks was not the I'm sorry, Ron.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Wouldn't you say that she's infamous instead of famous?
It depends who you are. I mean, if you're somebody who supported atheism and going to prison and freedom of speech and militarism and capitalism and marriage and free love and homosexuality and communism, so then she was famous. But she was infamous to a lot of people because she was one of these people that just could never be tied down. No matter what you tried to do, she was a rebel. And she would always find something to rebel against. The Spanish Civil War. I mean, it just was just who she was. And so she was a well-known writer, rebel. After her time in Russia, she left and went to Europe because she didn't like what she was seeing with the Bolsheviks. She thought they were quenching freedom of speech, which was against her view of communism. And so she went to Europe and started promoting other ideas throughout her time there. And so, you know, she was, although this was earlier on, some believe that the assassination of President McKinley was not due directly to her, but because of someone who heard her speaking and may or may not have mentioned killing the president of the United States, and somebody went out and did it. So she was infamous for that, but obviously they can never prove that. And she didn't have any involvement, direct involvement. But this is a woman who went all around the world promoting all of these ideas of free speech, of violence, of women's rights, although she was not a proponent of suffrage for some reason. She was very anti-war, so she was very excited about Woodrow Wilson saying we wouldn't go to war. And then, of course, after he's elected a second term, he decides we're going to war. So she was against the draft and really was kicked out of America. But in the 1930s, she was allowed back, sort of. She was allowed back to come as a speaker. Remember, this was during the Depression. So she was allowed to come back and speak in the US as long as she didn't incite rebellion and anarchy. And so she came back to the US in, I don't know, 1930s ish. And all of a sudden, guess what? She's now very popular and kind of didn't realize how famous she had become. And so she went around traveling throughout America and was really popular. And she was speaking to sold out halls. She went to Toronto. She was only allowed to be here for a certain amount of time. And then she went to Toronto, came back. And really, for 5 or 6 years, she was really famous. Her autobiography, which was written in the 30s, became, I think, a bestseller. And of course, eventually went to Spain. And, unfortunately, in Toronto, she died at 70, but she lived a full life. I think she had a stroke. But she is, as Gail said, if you're going to name somebody famous, what was she was famous for? She's famous for being an anarchist and not one of these peace-loving people that we usually lionize. She was out there, in some ways horrifying us. The idea of attempting to kill an industrialist who opposed unions seems very strange to us. Was it a different age? She was also born in a very violent age in Eastern Europe, raised by a violent father. And she was also very rebellious from birth. So this is a really interesting woman. I recommend reading her biographies. I hear they're amazing. I've not read them. I probably should. And when I have my free time, I will. It will be in 18 years when I retire. So, but she's not as well known today. Apparently, I think, excuse me, in the 1970s with the women's movement, she became very popular again. But for like 30 years, nobody knew who she was. So she kind of got, brought back to popularity through people like Steinem. But she is one of the great anarchists and probably the most famous woman anarchists in American history. Even though she was an anarchist here in Russia and Europe and in Canada, really became so with their associations here in America. Any thoughts or questions? Larry, and you're on mute, just to let you know.
Yeah, Rabbi, you had mentioned that she was deported back to Russia or to Russia, right? And
right. That's a good question. Was she deported because she was from there or because she was a communist? I don't know that answer. Yeah, but she was deported there.
What was that her punishment under the court? Because you said the
yes, it was exactly that was what happened. She was deported.
So were many anarchists deported at the time? Was there a wide movement of anarchism in the United States?
There wasn't a wide movement, but there were people who were deported more often than now. We have to remember, this time period is a little different. This is, I think she was deported in 1919, 1920, 1911. World War I has ended. We are entering a revolution of ideas and fun in America. Things are changing. And this is where the heightened anti-immigrant age really comes into focus. After World War I and in the early 1920s is really where this anti-immigrant population became really popular. There was so many immigrants coming into America before World War I, and then after World War I, they're coming again. And again, it wasn't really an anti-Jewish movement. It was an anti-immigrant movement. We chastised because they stopped letting Jews in, but they're stopping letting anybody in. I mean, maybe obviously from certain countries you could come in, Western Europe, obviously. So it was an anti-immigrant, out of America. And so the Bolshevik Revolution had taken the Russians out of the war, which we weren't so happy about because obviously we were. And so, yes, people were, it was kind of if you don't like America so much, why don't you go back to where you came from? So there were people being being taken back theoretically to wherever they were from. So yes, that was the probably the height of this happening was in the early 1920s. And this is when the immigration legislation really begins, where they stop the immigration. And so by 1924, immigration to America is very difficult. So she is sent during this time period. I don't know the numbers, but she was not the only one. She was probably one of the more famous ones because she was pretty well known even then. I think she became even more famous later. But she was not the only one by far. And it wasn't just to Russia. I mean, people will be sent back. But remember, the Bolshevik communism, although it's not the worst thing in the world in the 1920s, it's getting to that point where it's not, it actually, again, it wasn't that, I mean, communists were, it was allowed. It was, I don't think it was because she was communist as much as she was, so many other things. Any other thoughts? Communism really wouldn't become the worst thing in America until World War II. I mean, in the 30s, it was very popular in a lot of places. But this is a woman who, again, lived her life as she wanted and just didn't care, did what she did. She would find her revolution no matter where it was. It didn't matter if it was in Spain or Russia, America. She went to find the revolution. So, interesting lady. When I think of Ron Swartz, I think of someone who would be a perfect match with this woman. Sorry, Arlene. But, radicals like Ron need other radicals. So he missed his chance, obviously. They're from a different age. But if, I don't think, if he had been born, 70 years earlier. So that's Emma Goldman, a really interesting person, probably the most interesting person we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about a lot of interesting people. But the others, advocates are pretty, we think of Gloria Steinem as very famous, obviously, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or people like this, who we admire for so many things. And then you have this total rebel who tried to kill somebody and was not ashamed of it. And, really, it's kind of cool in so many ways. So that's Emma Goldman. So since I mentioned Gloria Steinem, we'll talk about Gloria Steinem, but we're not going to just talk about Gloria Steinem because obviously she's the most famous woman of the women's rights advocacy movement in the 70s. I mean, when you say women's rights 1970s on Google, what are you going to get? You're going to get Gloria Steinem. I mean, today people know the name Gloria Steinem. And so we'll talk about her, but we're also going to talk about two other, Bill Abzug and Betty Friedman, who were also very major contributors, not as famous, but very famous. They're famous more in the Jewish world in many respects, but whereas Gloria Steinem, everybody who, really is, even kids who don't know anything and may have heard of Gloria Steinem. So Gloria Steinem had a really interesting life, as we all can imagine. I don't think any of us would doubt that. She is American. She was born, of course, in America because she is obviously America. She's born in all places, Toledo, Ohio. So she must have loved watching MASH, and because we all know what was his name? Klinger was the famous person in MASH who was from Toledo. That's how we all know the Mud Hens, the famous baseball team. So she was born in Toledo, and most people don't know that her mother was not Jewish. Her father was Jewish, but her mother was not. She was Presbyterian. But was she Jewish? Yes, she was Jewish because really before her birth, I guess, her mother didn't go insane, but she had a lot of nervous breakdowns. And she'd eventually become an invalid and be delusional. And so Gloria Steinem never actually really knew her mother. Her father divorced her shortly after she was born or a few years later, but she was not really raised by her mother. She was raised by her father and her paternal grandmother. So she was basically raised in a Jewish household, although so which is interesting because traditionally she might not be considered Jewish, but everybody thinks of her as Jewish. So she was born in 1934, and she, of course, famously had the abortion. She had an abortion in the 1950s, and years later, of course, she would speak about it, and that would, of course, be one of the reasons she became who she became. She spent years in India. She was very prominent in so many areas. She served as director of independent research for the CIA, which people didn't realize at the time. She was, so she was influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. She was influenced by Betty Friedan, who we're going to talk about, who wrote a very famous book, The Feminine Mystique, that some of you may have read or have heard of. That book really helped her become what she would become, because she would write a very famous article, in many ways based upon it. She became a writer for Esquire, which women were, not always allowed to do, but not only a writer for Esquire, a writer who was given serious assignments, which really sent her on the road, because women were probably not given the assignments that we think of women can have today. They're probably more pieces that we would think are stereotypical women's pieces from the 50s and 60s. But she was, because she was so well thought of, she was given the opportunity to write on contraception. And then she was also able to write an article about women choosing between career and marriage, which was in no small state, based somewhat on the feminine mystique. She then became famous because she wrote an article that many of you may have heard of, speaking about how poorly Playboy bunnies were treated, the Howard Hughes Playboy bunnies. How did she write this insider article? I don't know if you guys may have known this. She what, Gail?
You mean Hugh Hefner?
Hugh, what did I say?
Howard Hughes.
Sorry, Hugh Hefner, by mistake. Well, how did she find, was she able to write the inside scoop on the bunnies?
She worked as a bunny.
She became a bunny herself, and that's how she got the inside scoop, the bunny's tail. And obviously the article featured a photo of her as a bunny, which obviously affected her ability to be a writer afterwards, because afterwards everybody said, I've seen you as a bunny. How can you be a serious writer? Fortunate enough, she did improve how the bunnies were treated. And years later, she was finally allowed to write again. She interviewed, obviously, famously, John Lennon. She spoke out for abortion in New York Magazine, which was very famous at the time. And then obviously she co-founded Miss, which was her famous magazine that she started with a couple others. And when she started it in 1972, they had no idea how big a deal this was going to be. But I think the first issue sold out, and they just couldn't keep it. It just kept selling and selling and selling. Many of you may have bought that first issue, but it really just kept selling. And, they had TV shows and there were other magazines, but this really helped her become the prominent figure in the women's movement of the 70s. And when money talks, and when people see this magazine selling out its first issue and continuing to sell out, then they realize what's going on. She represented She was one of the representatives at the major women's conference of the 70s, where Bella Abzug was also there, another Jewish woman, but other more famous people, Betty Ford, you know, President Lady Bird Johnson, Rosalind Carter, all these were there. She wrote for Cosmopolitan. She wrote about, very famously and funny, what would happen if men menstruated. And what did she talk about? She talked about if men did it, it wouldn't be something you talked about in secret. It would be a badge of courage, a point of pride, how tough I am to be able to do this. Whereas with women, it's got to be in the closet. We don't speak about it. Women are ostracized because of it, stereotyped because of it. But if men were to do it, oh, it would be like playing pro football. You know, I got hit in the head. I had concussions, but I broke my leg, but I toughed it out and I played the game. I went to work despite, and so obviously she is the most famous woman when it comes to this area. You know, even in recent times, she continues to be outspoken in so many ways against sex trafficking. She was a critic of the war when women were not allowed to be critics of anything. So she supported campaigns. She didn't support campaigns at times, which upset people, because people wanted her to support their campaign. Planned Parenthood. You know, this was a woman who just was a continual civil rights advocate, feminist, environmentalist, critic, and to this day has become one of the most famous women of the 20th century. Maybe the most famous woman who was not a political leader or married to a president or a presidential candidate. And certainly, yes, Flossie, and a lot of you will know more. I mean, I was a child in the 70s, so I wasn't there. Flossie.
You're mentioning both these women under Jewish women. You have not mentioned either of them in anything they did Jewishly, or did they recognize themselves as Jewish women other than just being born into that?
Yes, they did. They recognized themselves as Jewish women. They were not religious. They didn't do, we'll talk about some others who were more involved in the Jewish world. They were Jewish, but they didn't really, you know, do a lot as much in terms of teaching Sunday school or being president of the sisterhood or Hadassah or being president of the congregation. You know, that was not her role. I mean, she was the woman who would protest pornography or support gay marriage, same-sex marriage, you know, even transgender rights she was supporting way before anybody else was. So she is kind of very similar to Emma Goldman. They're both women who are looking for the revolution. One did it in one way, anarchy, violence. One did it in a different way, through writing, through speaking out, through nonviolence, through becoming popular, writing magazines. They were, though, women of different ages. We all wonder if Emma Goldman had been born the year that Gloria Steinem had, and Gloria Steinem had been born the year of Emma Goldman, would they have been very taken the others' roles? Because really, they're looking, I mean, they both are famous for something. Gloria Steinem is famous for women's rights. Emma Goldman's famous for being an anarchist, but they did so many other things. I mean, they go from one revolution to the next, always speaking out, always trying to remain prominent, always trying to push the button, not letting anybody rest on their laurels. Yay, we've given women some rights. Well, you know what? That's not enough. That is a start. And what about gay? What about people who are suffering, you know, here? What about people who are trans? I mean, she's speaking about transgender in the 1970s, trying to find rights for them. I mean, my goodness, the gay rights movement wasn't until the 1980s, and she's talking about transgender in the 1970s. So she is the woman who is famous for being, of course, you know, supporting women's rights. But when it comes to Judaism, I think she recognized herself as Jew, but I don't know that much about her doing stuff in the Jewish world. That must be something I'd have to look up. I know she did some things. She spoke at Jewish events and that kind of stuff, but somebody may know more about that than me.
Well, she attended the first women's only Passover Seder along with held in New York City.
So and again, these are the things she did. She did do that's it. She was very, but I don't think she was as involved in just like purely Jewish stuff as we'll see some of the others. And neither was Emma Goldman. Although she stayed Jewish, she was not, one of these women who was very involved in the Jewish world. There were some who were, though. And let's go to, we have about 20 minutes. We may do Bella Abzug and Betty Friedan. We'll do them later because we'll do this, I think, next week. Let's go to someone then who was much more involved in the Jewish world and not only famous for what she did outside, but very much a very popular social activist who was also very much dedicated to her Jewish roots. And that would be Gertrude Weil. Again, someone born in the 19th century, but became famous for suffrage and the labor movements and civil rights in the 20th century. So she's born in North Carolina to German Jews. So she's first generation America, of course, living in North Carolina. She's living in a very open world compared to what her parents would have been in. You want your kids to be, this is like us. You want you're American, you want them to be Jewish in America. North Carolina apparently is a very good place to be. And her parents had been instrumental in forming one of the synagogues there, one of the earliest synagogues. And so would remain dedicated to the synagogue there, as would she. She obviously, didn't go to Jewish school because back then you took advantage of, public school. She was very sick from a young age, so not healthy, but, she saw the work of progressive women, and her mom was one of those people. Her mom established a women's club that became very popular and was not suffrage oriented, but really, women serving in the community. And she went to Smith College, which was a women's college, obviously a very prominent women's college, where women were not only there to learn, but really start to be leaders. They even held their own mock election in 1900, which I found very interesting. By the way, McKinley won over Bryan, which was not surprising. So she was educated. She had traveled a lot. This is a woman who was very, very prominent, and she then decides to move back to North Carolina. She's not going to be a teacher. She decides instead of she's going to move back to North Carolina and be involved there. And she becomes very involved in North Carolina in so many ways, with her mother's women's organization, with other women's organizations, and especially becomes known for the suffrage movement. And she is one of the key leaders in the suffrage movement in the South, especially in North Carolina. And even though a lot of people were not as supportive of the suffrage movement in the early 1900s, she was very much so. And in the 1910s, she became very, very prominent, becoming president and vice president of different organizations for women's clubs and for suffrage movements. And of course, 1920, she was there helping was passed, which it was. Although, funny enough, North Carolina never supported the amendment. She tried and over again, and North Carolina did not support the suffrage amendment until 1971. So I thought that was, that's interesting. So she was, obviously that was disappointing to her, but she also was very active in other ways in her community as a social worker, fighting for labor, for women's rights, very much in support of the civil rights movement. And she's really started supporting civil rights in the 1930s. And she became one of the leading advocates for organizations where African American women worked with non-African American women to try and financially support them, how to create ways to get anti-lynching laws. And so she became one of the leaders of the civil rights movement before there was a civil rights movement. That's why her name is not as famous, because she's doing this work in the 1930s, trying to even end segregation. But beyond that, she probably knew that was not feasible. So she worked more towards, how do we financially help this group of people? How do we educate them? How do we improve race relations by having us work together? She invited people over to her home and started different organizations, which I imagine was not well thought of, to have African American women come to your home to speak about how to improve their lives and how to educate them, and to how to teach them how to really work together to create better conditions. So separate but equal was something she knew very early on was not true. So during all of this, she opposed everything from secret ballots, from criminal. She very famous. I think she broke in somewhere and she took all of these ballots that were there, illegal ballots that were going to be stuffed into a box, and she famously burnt them. So this is the type of, so she's not a radical like Emma Goldman, and she may not, Burnham may have been, the legend later on, but she did ensure that not only women had the right to vote, but they would have the right to vote in secret. I mean, she'd go to the polls and men would be there watching who women were voting for, and they had the right to watch them do it. And could be, as we imagine, very intimidating. How many of us want to go to the poll and not have those things and yell out who we're voting for, especially if it's not somebody everybody else wants? So this was who she was: labor reform, reform for African Americans, women's rights, civil rights, anti-lynching laws. But through all this, unlike some of the other women like Gloria Steinem, she was very involved in her Jewish community. Her parents had helped found the synagogue, and she stayed at that synagogue and helped with the sisterhood and teaching Sunday school, and helped bring, obviously, all of these ideas outside of the Jewish community into the Jewish community. You can only imagine the percentage of women in her sisterhood who were fighting for suffrage, who were fighting for women's rights, who were fighting for all these things because she was there. So I imagine North Carolina, and this is one of the reasons, was filled with Jewish women promoting these ideas, which was probably very strange. So she was basically on probably every Jewish organizational board, from associations for women's rights to Jewish aged homes for uniting, very, very big into bringing Orthodox and Reform women together. Kind of the men can squabble over those religious issues, but we need to come together to really make the world better. And that's what she was famous for. never got married, as many of these other great women also. And you think about, why did she get married? Well, obviously, having a career like this and getting married might be very constraining, because your husband may look at you in a certain way, expect something. If you're this type of woman, and how is your husband treated by the other men in the world? Can you find a husband who can do this? Can you find a husband who is going to be first husband? You think of a president, somebody who is going to be willing to have his wife be this major activist, and to have everybody look at him like, what is going on? And this is, I think, one of the reasons many of these women may not have been able to get married, because you couldn't find men who were good enough or strong enough. Yes, Larry.
While we're kind of on the subject, I mean, we're on the periphery here, but could you give us a little bit of a background as to how women moved from, let's say, the sisterhood to the presidency, to the in the reform movement, to the rabbinical movement? Was there some precipitating event that was it part of the original reform movement agenda to have women more involved?
It definitely was. So the reform movement was definitely supportive of women being more involved, but nowhere near to the level we see today. But confirmation, bat mitzvah, these were things that were thought of early on. And so, yes, the reform movement has been very instrumental, but we don't live in a vacuum. So the reform movement has been very instrumental, but the outside world has been instrumental as well. And women have been major movers and shakers in the reform movement, but often from the background as well. You first started to see women getting more positions of power outside simply women's groups as time goes on. But really, the women's movement in the 1970s changed the game in the Jewish world as well. I think the reform movement had been ahead of the game, but nowhere near to the level that we probably should have been. And so the 1970s is really when it all, you can all start with World War II, where Jews are serving with alongside others in World War II. You serve along a Jew, you never met a Jew before, you're from the middle of nowhere, you never met a Jew, and all of a sudden you're serving in war next to a Jewish person. And then all of a sudden, what happens in the 1940s, when all the men are working, are in the military, what are the women doing? They're running companies, they're working on the lines. So even though men coming back and forcing them out of these positions, but they've already been there. And the women's movement probably starts with the World War II. And these women who in the 1950s do not want to be June Cleaver, which is not a bad thing, but they've tasted it. So it all comes to head in the civil rights movement, and then the women's movement in the 70s. So in the 70s, you'll start seeing more and more women become presidents of congregation. You'll start seeing the first women rabbis and the first women cantors in the 70s and 80s. You'll start seeing women who want to be part of, writing legislation, and not just being one or two congresswomen and senators, but more and more, still not to the point where it's equal today. But that's really, so the reform movement falls completely in line with the civil rights movement and the women's movement. But to say that women would have their role in the reform movement today without the 70s women's movement, I don't think that would be the case. I think we'd still be ahead of the game. But outside forces have really changed the Jewish world. And
some culminating event, though, that led to, let's say, the first woman rabbi, from the reform, first woman rabbi.
Well, there's no culminating event. Henrietta Zold may have been the first woman. She was brilliant. She was the editor for the Jewish Publication Society. She was maybe the first woman who was allowed to study at rabbinical school. This is like 1900s. but she was not allowed to be ordained. And even if she thought about it or mentioned it, they would have kicked her out. She's the
Regina
only woman
Jones-
who was, I'm sorry?
Regina Jones was the first female rabbi.
Right. Officially, Regina Jones is sort of, but
She
the
wasn't ordained.
yeah. But the first one really would have been Sally Priesen. I mean, Regina Jones has the moniker, but to be a synagogue rabbi, to really be considered a rabbi, would have been Sally Priesen in 1974.
Mhm.
And she kind of bullied her way into rabbinical school. I'm going in, but I'm not going to be a rabbi. Once she's in, she's like, I'm going to be a rabbi. And everybody's saying, no, you're not. And then eventually she says, I am going to be a rabbi. Deal with it. Because of the outside forces and women like Gloria Steinem and Miss Magazine and all of these things going on, women's rights and protests, the Reform Seminary really was almost bullied into this. I don't know if they wanted to feel the ramifications of kicking this woman out. I mean, she may have had trouble finding jobs, but because she was a woman, but that's really what happened. But the women, it's not one moment in time, Larry. I think it's a culmination of things throughout history. But our congregation's first female president was Jane Filer. I think it was in the 1980s. So, and we've been a congregation since 1733. So we weren't exactly the stalwart of this women for president, but we're now, if we fixed it, we're doing a lot better, but there's always room for improvement. But you're right, Larry. I don't know if there's one moment in time. I mean, certainly Sally Priesen. I think Gloria Steinem's Miss Magazine was a major step. But I think the civil rights movement as well. I mean, the civil rights movement proved that if you protest peacefully, vehemently, and continuously, you can make change. And that's what women did in the 70s, and we see that today. Not that that's perfect. There's a lot of people who are anti-women out there, as we know, in positions of power. I think of anybody, and I know some of you aren't Star Wars fans, but 10 years ago, maybe, they came out, Star Wars had 3 movies that were amazing. Then 15 years later, they had 3 more that were okay. And then 10 years later, 12 years later, they had a new Star Wars movie. And of course, this is a big deal because they're so infrequent. And so, it makes $1.7 billion. I mean, it's obviously a smash. What were the negatives that all the protests online against the Star Wars movies? The major hero in the Star Wars movies were
Men.
women.
Oh,
The women were really much more important than the men. In the
Wait.
trailers, it looked like the men, and the men had some roles, but it's really the women
in early Star Wars?
in the new Star Wars, in the recent
Oh,
Star
the
Wars.
new Star Wars. Okay.
And then the second movie came out, and the women are even more prominent. And so online, you had all of these protests and these men talking about how terrible it was. There was one woman who was abused so much online, this actress had to give up her Facebook account. She was traumatized because she had so much hate mail because, she gets the part of a lifetime and she's getting all this hate mail because of it. And so what happened was you would see now these men who go out, and when it comes to movies where women are heroines or have bigger parts than men, they will invade all of the internet with bad reviews. So see these movies come out and they'll have horrible reviews. Why? Because these terrible men will send nonstop terrible reviews about the movie because there is a woman lead, or it's about a same-sex marriage, or it has, something about abortion, but mostly with women in the lead, especially in action movies. Yes, Flossie.
Rabbi, you mentioned Gertrude. What's her last name?
Gertrude Weil.
Weil, W-I-L-E?
Yeah, so she is the
WEIL.
suffrage leader in North Carolina. WEIL.
Oh, E-I-L. Okay, thank you.
I mean, she's not just a suffrage leader; she's an activist.
You know, it's interesting, Rabbi, when you look at the Black women's movement, there were some very great similarities as far as leadership and women coming to the forefront when you think of leadership. Of course, not Martin Luther King, but others in that ilk.
There is, and again, women. I mean, you can't compare the women's world today probably to 100 years ago or even 40 years ago, but you can compare women's world to men's world. And there's still, as far as we've come, there's still a lot. I mean, women are running major companies, from Google to, I don't know anything about business, but we know they're running. There are women who are senators and congresswomen. Hasn't been a woman president, but, there's been a woman who ran for president. There's a woman vice president, but still there's still a lot of men out there who are not supportive of women in power. So it's something we'll get over eventually. But I think it's in all worlds and some more than others. But certainly outside. Michael?
Speaking of Star Wars, Leonard Nimoy is not only Jewish, but actually lived a very Jewish life. And there are several YouTube things about his knowledge of Yiddish and how he grew up. Very, very interesting.
He edited a lot of Yiddish books on tape. He did a lot. And William Shatner's Jewish, and he's still alive. I saw him speak.
Who was Jewish?
William Shatner. He's played Captain Kirk. I go to the Dragon Con, which is a big sci-fi convention in Atlanta, and we waited in line a long time to see him. And he spoke, he's in his 90s and he's speaking several times. So they limit him to 45 minutes because he's speaking, he's doing all that. It's incredible. If you don't like him, I mean, this guy is really active in his early 90s, went to space. I think he's the oldest man to go to space. And he spoke for 45 minutes, not on his television career or his movie career, not on Star Trek. I mean, he's been in so many, he spoke 45 minutes mostly about his poetry.
Oh, really?
And it was one of the best 45 minutes of my life.
No.
He was hilarious, so engaging. When people came up to speak, he was making fun of them in nice ways. I mean, it was hilarious. I mean, this guy was 45. He could be easily a stand-up comedian. I mean, he was hilarious speaking about his life and his poetry. And
what's his poetry about?
I have absolutely no idea. He was just so funny. It was like 45 minutes of me just laughing. I mean, the guy is charisma. Whether you like him as an actor or not, he is, he's kind of cliched and kind of made fun of a lot, but man, he is engaging and amazing. Wow.
Why don't you bring him into your act, Rabbi?
If I could bring him into Savannah, that would be something, but I can't afford him. I'm sure his price is
maybe you should do a one-man show about him. You could be
when he dies, that might be in 30 years after he dies, 40 years, because I'm pretty sure he may actually be immortal. So he is going to be he's 93 right now. So he's doing, but he still has a full career, which is amazing.
Yes.
But yeah, so and there's a movie called Fanboys. It wasn't a big hit, but basically it's about these super Star Wars fans who are one of them has cancer, and they want to see the new Star Wars movie in the 1990s, and the guy's not going to live long enough to see it come out, so they want to break into Lucas, the studios, which is in Skywalker Ranch in California. It didn't get reviews, but they're trying to figure how are they going to get plans to Skywalker Ranch. Skywalker Ranch is like, at that time, was so well guarded. It was like Fort Knox or the CIA. And so they go for a secret meeting, and who's there? It's William Shatner, who gives them these plans. And they're like, well, how did you score these? He said, I'm William Shatner. I can score anything. And that was his of that line. I'm William Shatner. I can score anything. And that was pretty much his whole line. So, all right. So next week we'll continue women. If you want to bring up some of your own, just email Women of the 20th Century. We're going to talk about Bella Abzug, Betty Friedman, Henrietta Zold, Ruth Handler, obviously has become very famous now. We didn't get to as many, maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Gertrude Elion, and we may talk about Madeleine Albright, who didn't know she was Jewish, but found out at the end of her career that her parents were. Flossie.
How about Hannah Shemesh?
I was going to do that, but I did so many Israeli ones. I can do Hannah Shemesh as well if we want.
And also, I'm the one who mentioned to you, if you want to check with who the women's tables were, they did the
Right,
top.
I should do. Katie, I was going to ask her, and she's out, so I'll have to figure that out later.
Okay.
Have you already done Golda Meir?
We did Golda Meir because we did a bunch of weeks on Israel.
Okay.
But I'm happy to go over that with her, with you anytime. So that's why Hannah Senesh. I don't know did we bring up Hannah Senesh when we did as famous Israelis? We may not have got to her.
No,
We didn't get to her. We did so many. So we'll do her again. Henrietta Zold is also Israeli. I mean, she moved there, but obviously she became famous in America.
Did you do Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
We did
too?
not. We may do that next week.
Okay.
She's on the list for this week, but obviously we didn't get to a lot of them. And you never know if you're going to talk about somebody for 10 minutes or 25 or 30 minutes, and we're no rush because we do this every week. So we'll do it next week. But if there's anybody, we'll do Hannah Senesh. We may not get to that person next week, but we'll get to the person the week after if we don't, because I want to be able to go on tangents because I have trouble concentrating on anything at all. So the
Wait
mere
till you
fact,
age.
I'm basically a softer Emma Goldman. I'm like going from one, there's a revolution, I'm going to be there, but I'm just too timid to be her.
You're not going to assassinate anybody.
No, I'm not going to assassinate anybody. No.
I could make some suggestions.
I mean, there may be people I'm thinking about assassinating. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not, that radical of a person. So everyone have a good one. As for things coming up, we have congregations and service this Sunday. So if you want to come here and join other houses of worship as we do acts of loving kindness. So it's a social action day. It's going to be at 1:00 this Sunday. And so you can do anything from, is it this Sunday? Yeah, it's this Sunday, right? Yeah, this Sunday. Anything from sitting down and doing stuff to going to a park and cleaning up. We do with other houses of worship. It's a nice way. 4:00 this Sunday at the JA is the Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day event. So that is this Sunday, 4:00 at the JA. As for other things coming up, we of course have our Shabbaton on the 17th. It's a weekend retreat. It has nothing to do with hiking. You can stay at a cabin. You can come for a couple hours. There'll be everything from fun services to discussions to, campouts. It's not like living in the woods. If you stay there, you're living in a room. Larry.
Yeah, Rabbi, just as a real side topic, I know we're all familiar with Columbia University and what's happening.
Yeah.
Has there been any incidents or any anti-Semitism that you know of at SCAD or the local places?
None here. There've been a couple
they have such a
protests.
universal student population.
Right. There's been none. There's been a couple of protests, but all peaceful. So we've had no issues in this area. A lot of this is in certain areas. And I'm going to talk about this on Saturday, what's going on. We're all thinking about it. And it's the irony is there are so many ironies with what's going on that it is, almost laughable. But we'll talk about that. But we haven't had any issues here. Thank goodness. I don't think there's been, in the South, there's been almost no issues. At the University of Texas, they've had some, but the state government has been very, very supportive of the Jewish community there. So it's mostly a few colleges in the Northeast and a couple places. I think they're trying to mimic. I don't think most of these students really knows what's going on. I think they want to just have a rebellion. They want to protest against something, and this is what's going on, and just kind of is spreading.
Many of
It's
them have been
excuse not to take
outsiders.
final exams.
They've
Yeah,
been
they're-
outsiders. brought
Yeah,
in.
some of the outsiders. Yeah, and the same happens here. When we had the big Black Lives Matter, protest here in Savannah, the city officials very supportive, and they got all the clergy together. They got other people together. So, it was a major protest, probably the biggest one I've seen here. And they said, listen, there's going to be people coming from the outside who are going to try and instigate things. We want you to surround these guys and just follow them. Let them say whatever they want. But wherever they go, just tell people not to do anything. So there were several people there trying to pick fights with police officers, with others, and every one of them had somebody around him saying, just leave him alone. He's not from here, ensuring that instigator couldn't do anything. And it worked perfectly.
That's
So
good.
if you do that, unfortunately, these college students are not sophisticated or wise enough. They want to protest. Some of them want to be violent. We see what's happening in Columbia. There will probably be severe ramifications for invading a space. If people do it, protest calmly and really protest what's going on with the Gaza people, support for them, that's fine. Nobody has an issue with that. It's the anti-Semitism that is no longer hidden in these protests.
But
And-
keep in mind that 3 days from now will be the anniversary of 4 students being killed by the National Guard while protesting.
Hopefully that will not happen again. This is a whole different people and I think the students are comparing this to Vietnam, which is no comparison at all. It just makes no sense. Israel wasn't even in Gaza before this, and there are no American troops over there. And it's just insane. But, they're students, and hopefully they'll learn better as time goes on. But until that moment, it makes it very scary for the rest of us.
I'm not
Real
willing to stipulate
separation.
that the pro-Palestinian rallies are necessarily anti-Semitic.
No, I don't think. I think they're the overt anti-Semitic feelings you're getting are now everywhere. Now, do I think all the students are that way? No, it's just like Black Lives Matter had some anti-Semitism, but most people didn't even think about it or even know it. It was just other people trying to usurp it, and that's what we see here: the anti-Zionists, the kill all Zionists, to kill Hillel. There's been some anti-Hillel stuff because they're supporting Israel. But we just have to be careful to watch out and make sure our Congress people and obviously those of you in Sun City, you can talk to your Congress people and your senators, and we can do it to ours. Make sure our mayors and everybody understands that we're not, trying to, stop free speech, because free speech is essential. But there's free speech and there's free speech, and one of them is very nicely protected by and rightly so, by our Constitution and the other, speaking in terms of genocide and hurting people and killing all people, that is not protected by free speech laws. And I think our students are not understanding this. So hopefully it'll get worse before it gets better. But I think a lot of it has been the fault of these universities, quite frankly. I think they've allowed this anti-Semitic, pretend anti-Israel, but really anti-Semitic rhetoric to run free on their campuses for so long, and just put it to the side, supported it even. You have a lot of professors going out there and supporting it. And we know a lot of the money coming from the Arab world. We know a lot of and so they've just let it run wild, and now it's biting them in the tuchus, because now that they want to stop, they've been just letting it go for all these years. We've been complaining about it, talking about it, protesting them, letting this do it, and now it's just gone wild, and they're paying the price also. So we'll see, and we are too, unfortunately. But
one of the problems is that the free speech seems to be always the most prominent thing on the minds of the courts. And the
Right.
courts in general have always voted in favor of free speech versus all the other arguments. So
right.
the other arguments have taken second place, and where you draw that line is very, very fuzzy. And can you incite it, or it just becomes a very complicated argument.
Well, and I think also it's the administration, because if you see all these professors on these campuses are supporting it, They're supporting a lot of the anti-Semitic rhetoric because they hire
Name
these
of free
people.
speech. Yeah.
Not only name of free speech because they're anti-Semitic, I think some of them themselves. I think a lot of them have been hired and allowed to do this. We all knew who the anti-Semitic professors were when I went to the University of Texas, and they've been allowed to speak out and to mold the minds of these kids. They're going to the rallies. Where in other protests, the administration and the professors kind of stay out of it and let the kids, but now they're supporting it and engaging and that makes it a lot worse. And these professors who have tenure, a lot of them, not all of them, and a lot of them have been chastising Israel and the Zionists for years, and they're the ones hired, and a lot of money comes from places that, Gail.
I have a question. So a lot of people are saying to me that it's leftist groups and Jews that are supporting this. What do you say to that?
There are some Jews doing it. There are Jews. I think a lot of the Jews are not well educated. We haven't educated a lot of our people, our kids. I think a lot of it is just kids who want to protest. I think, and then other people are taking advantage of this. I think a lot of these Palestinian groups, these professors and others are taking advantage of kids, the numbers who want to protest, who don't really know what's going on. As a leftist, yeah, there's a lot of lefties, but there's a lot of people on the right who are anti-Semitic as well. I mean, it's radicals. There's,
why do you think that that the South has fewer issues with this?
Well, one, there's a lot less Jews here. That's always been the case. And just when you have less people, and that's one of the things too, the South has always been very supportive. There hasn't been a lot of anti-Semitism traditionally in the South. It's been focused elsewhere, unfortunately for those. I think I think the numbers have really, there's so many more Jews in the North and Northeast that this issue is so much more prominent. I think, and it's been so focused there because all of these instigators focus on the big major universities that let it happen, that are taking in money from these places and are letting it happen. So it's a shame. Yeah. And hopefully no violence, nobody will be hurt. That's what we pray. But we'll talk more about it later. But again, it is something to speak out to your congresspeople and to say thank you for ensuring that protests are allowed. We've had them here in Savannah. No worries. The first protest we had, the first thing they said is, we're not being anti-Semitic. We're just supporting the rights of the people in Gaza, which whether you agree or not, that's the type of protest they should be doing.
Well, this would be a lot more clear cut if Israel weren't blowing it so badly.
Israel has a lot of, but you got to understand, and I'm not very supportive of the current Israeli government for reasons beyond what's going on now. So it's not like I'm a Netanyahu fan, but Israel's always been chastised. It's never not been, using a double negative. So it's always had these issues. For years, Israel didn't try and they didn't care. And that was also an issue. They didn't care what the world thought. They still don't. And that kind of thing has hurt them in the media. But there's so many things. There's so many, think of the Arab countries that have been anti-Israel. There's billions of them. There's only a few million Jews. We're just so tiny. There's so much more money on the other side than we have, just so much more. And Israel's a free country, which is a problem when it comes to the media, because if you want to go to the Arab world or you want to go into the Palestinian world, you cannot, if you want access, you have to say what they want you to say, or else they just deny you access. Hamas is not going to give interviews to people who say something negative about them. You say what I want you to say, otherwise you don't get an interview. And if you don't get an interview, that reporter doesn't have a job. Where in Israel, they say you can say whatever you want. You cannot, go into secret facilities, but you come to Israel legally, you can write whatever you want about the government. We don't care. We're a free society. And that's also a big issue. So Israel's always been behind the 8 ball. They always will.
Yeah, but for most of its history, Israel has legitimately held the high moral ground. And I don't think you can say that today.
Well, whether they've held the high moral ground or not, they've still always been chastised for not holding it. I mean, they've always been chastised as a terrible country, especially since the 67 war. And I mean, in America, it's been a little bit better, but outside of America, almost everything said about Israel is terrible. And so when it comes to the moral ground, that's, again, Israel was attacked. Israel did leave Gaza. Then on the other side, they're killing a lot of people. So it's hard to know who has any moral ground anymore. There's 20,000 plus people who have died. A high percentage are terrorists, but the rest are innocent. So it's hard to know. In a war, nobody has the moral ground. The only thing I can say for 100% true is Hamas is evil. They are the bad guy, unequivocally. If the Palestinians had a better government, it might have forced Israel to do other things, but Israel's government is not going to acquiesce now either. Israel has become much more hardline because of what happened in the 90s and early 2000s when they tried to make peace and it was refused. I don't know who has, but whether or not Israel has the moral ground anymore, they are portrayed as the worst country in the world, as the worst human beings. I just read something on CBS News that, Israel's killed 35,000 people, almost all of them women and children, according to Hamas. So this is CBS making it sound like Israel is targeting women and children only, which is obviously not the case. Israel's doing something they shouldn't do, but they're trying to kill terrorists. They're not so it's just the way you write all these things. So I'm not, again, a big supporter of Netanyahu in any ways. I hope this war ends very soon. I don't want any more innocents killed. Israel has a right to protect itself. I don't know who has the high moral ground, but it certainly isn't Hamas. But I know not everybody agrees with me. But it's okay to protest. It's okay to give your thought. It's just not okay to give your thought and say, I protest genocide. Let's kill all Jews.
Right.
That's what we're seeing. I protest genocide from the river to the sea, which is kill all Jews. I protest it's like they had the anti-violence, they had the anti-war, anti-violence protests in Chicago and a couple places, and they get reports that Iran just sent missiles at Israel. And what do they start doing? Cheering, chanting, kill as many Israelis, kill Jews. That's what they started chanting. It's like, so the ironies are terrible, but God willing, we'll get over this period. We've had much worse times than this. So I digressed a lot. I apologize. I'll talk more about it on Saturday. Not everybody, I don't agree with me, Jeff. I hope, sorry if I didn't agree with you completely, but I do agree with you. Huh?
You're forgiven.
I agree with you mostly.
Yes.
So, but yeah, does Israel have the high moral ground? That could be a great discussion itself. I have the answer, but we're not going to talk about today because we want you to tune in next week or come on Saturday. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody, for this upcoming week. And also I forgot one more thing. A week from Saturday is Mother's Day service. The Women for Israel working really hard to do a great service. So everybody should come to that one. And most importantly, just to let you know, I'm doing nothing for it. So that'll entice you to come.
Can I pass along one thought, Rabbi?
Huh?
I'd like to pass along one thought.
Please, Jeff.
Bob Greenberg.
Uh-huh.
Doing a fantastic job.
Bob Greenberg is doing a fantastic job. He has been amazing. He's our executive director. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Sorry we went 23 minutes over. Next week, we will talk about more 20th century influential Jewish women.
Thank you very
Have
much.
a good one, everybody.
Thanks.